Hello, you wonderful people. So for today's video, I'm going to talk about adaptations, specifically like The Last of Us, but just adaptations in general. Now, I won't spoil anything about The Last of Us. I'll probably try to keep things pretty vague. So this isn't like a review, this isn't like a breakdown of The Last of Us, but like I said, it feeds into a general, larger conversation of adaptations. Because adapting something seems to be in this interesting spot, because it's like, right, with The Last of Us, some people, and I don't like discount anyone's concerns or reasons why they're not into The Last of Us as much, because they felt like, right, either they're like, right, I've already seen this story because the game already did it so well, so I don't need to see it. TV show format. I think the show does a really good job of changing certain things while also adding stuff, because that was the thing I was most excited about, to see like, all right, so what are the things they're going to keep the same, what things are they going to tweak, and what things are they going to completely change. And we've seen all three throughout the show so far. At the time we recorded this, obviously episode 4 came out this week, but episode 3, once again, no spoilers, major departure from the game, which it's kind of been a plus and minus for some people in certain regards. We're the extreme side of things, like, we're not talking about those people, but just in general, someone not liking the direction they took, which, you know, I can see that criticism. And once again, I thoroughly enjoyed the episode, but if someone's like, oh, it didn't fit what I wanted, then that's understandable. But like I said, it's in this interesting spot because, like I said, it's done all three. And so, because some adaptations are very loose, like, hey, we take this name and this concept and we kind of do our own thing while paying homage to maybe the original story. Like Marvel stuff, like there are Marvel things in the MCU that are shot for shot stuff taken straight from the comics, panel to screen type of stuff, but they also have taken those certain stories and gone their own route with. Like, obviously a great big example, not really even a spoiler because we're years out from it, is Civil War. Captain America Civil War is that the essence of it is still there, but it's vastly different from the reasons behind why Civil War happened in the comics, and also who's involved. There's a large number of heroes involved in the movie, but obviously in the comics it includes everyone, including the X-Men. So obviously that's a vast departure in that regard, and at the time Disney didn't have access to the mutant X-Men characters, and so that's a whole conversation in itself. But that's just kind of give you an example of the MCU in particular. Kind of goes like, yeah, we're building a story around this concept from the comics, and we'll pull some of the themes and elements from it, but we're kind of doing our own thing with how we represent it, for whether it's just, we don't want to do a carbon copy, because that's where you get into that interesting, like I said before, interesting territory of like, some people probably do want a carbon copy, but for other people it's like, you lose something when you're shifting mediums. You know, that's why some people had issue with Cowboy Bebop. They're like, this isn't Bebop because it lost its essence of, like, there's certain things that can only be done in animation. I know I like the Cowboy Bebop TV live action adaptation. You didn't, that's perfectly fine. I'm just talking about me personally. So I'm a lot more lenient with a lot of those adaptation stuff, which I know that's not the case with a lot of people. The Last of Us seems to be, for one, the best video game adaptation in a lot of people's minds. And because for me, adaptations are in this really interesting spot, because there's a lot, like The Last of Us, I remember enough of the story clearly in my head so I can make comparisons. I'm like, ooh, they changed this, ooh, they didn't change that, ooh, they've added this. So I'm able to kind of be a part of that conversation. But like, obviously comic books, I'm not well versed in comics, so I know a lot of like superhero TV shows and stuff like that. Some of the shows that I love, I know have taken liberties from some of the, so I know I've done enough, you know, I have above average knowledge of like superhero, like stuff like Marvel and comics. I have like above average knowledge, but I'm not like an encyclopedia like other people are. So I'm able to kind of be like, oh, I know what, like, oh, I know these particular characters might end up being a thing because they're a thing in the comics or something like that. Or, oh, I know what this storyline could lead to because I'm slightly versed enough in this story. Like, I've read up enough on this character's stories in the comic or something like that, you know? So that's where you kind of get the interest, because like, I know like they take stuff from the comics, but the TV shows and stuff like that, very much like the movies, superhero-wise, kind of do their own thing, obviously. Because the most recent adaptations, I would kind of say, like, are typically one-to-one, I would often say would be like, and manga, going from manga to anime, typically end up being like a more direct, like those are typical, I would assume like panel for panel, but those are always also in an interesting spot too, because you also have to think about pacing for an anime, and anime can end up covering maybe 3-4 chapters of a manga or a manhwa one like 20-minute episode or something like that. So that's also an interesting thing with like adaptations too, is kind of a pacing thing. But kind of staying in that vein, for me, would be like Lookism. Lookism is an animated series on Netflix. It's based on a webtoon manhwa of the same name. I've not read Lookism in such a long time, so I vaguely remember certain things, but there are certain things where I'm like, oh, I feel like they changed that. I feel like they changed that. So once again, that's what puts The Last of Us in such an interesting spot, because I like know that story. I've seen that story enough to have it memorized in my head, but you know, other stuff, it's been like far enough removed where it's like I have vague memories of it, so I can't always make that compare and contrast. Now, an interesting spot is Trails of Cold Steel Northern War. It's an anime on Crunchyroll. Now, what makes it interesting, because if you know anything about me, because I won't shut up about it because I talk about it all the time, I love the video game franchise, the Trails series, or Kaseki series as it's known in Japan. It's a JRPG franchise that's been going on for a while now, and there's never really been too many anime adaptations. I want to say like Trails in the Sky got adapted into like a couple episode OVAs, but that's about it. Which puts Trails of Cold Steel Northern War in a very interesting spot, because it's not fully an adaptation, but it kind of is, but it kind of isn't, because it's a in-between story that takes place in between Trails of Cold Steel 2 and 3. There's this very big event called the Northern War, which you get certain details about it in the third game that this story takes place in. You're following mainly original characters and their stories, but obviously the whole setting is lead up and eventually into the Northern War and the events that led up to it, and how these characters, their roles they end up playing in it, but also the roles of these other characters you know from Cold Steel 3, you know, because of the story that was talked about in Cold Steel 3 that tells you like their roles in the Northern War. So it's this interesting place with an adaptation, because it's an original story, but it's adapting something you only hear a little bit about. So there's a lot more freedom and liberties in that regard, because you can kind of tell whatever you're still confined in some regards with adapting it, but it's still a thing of you have the guidelines of like what it has to pertain, what it has to contain, where it has to end up. But everything in between, you kind of can do a little bit of what you want. And that's why we get to have these characters from this country of Northumbria that you really don't know. You're familiar with the Northern Jaegers. Obviously, out of context, none of this matters to you, like unless you know Trails of Cold Steel. But I think it's in such a unique position of, because it's adapting this storyline that leaves so much room open for you to kind of do your own thing. Actually, I should have looked into it, because I'm actually curious. Like, I don't know the people who are writing this anime, whether it's people from Falcom writing. You would assume like either Falcom is directly involved in writing the story and someone else is just animating it, or someone else is writing it, but they have to get Falcom's okay with what they write, you know, because you are adapting someone else's stuff. So I don't know. I would assume it's the former, but maybe it's the latter, or maybe it's a combination of the two. I never actually really looked into it. I should have. I'm going on this whole tangent because, like I said, it's such an interesting conversation about adapting something. Like that's all. Like I said, that balancing act is always going to be interesting. Because for some people, because I want to say, who was it that was recently talking about? I want to say it was BK from Achievement Hunter. She had said, like, if you want to adapt something, like, get the beginning right, and I'll be a lot more forgiving of any changes or anything completely different you want to do later on. Because I know that ends up being a point of contention with, like, The Witcher, where they feel like, obviously, there's been the rumors, and I think someone came out and said it, was the whole thing of, hey, they're not being faithful to the games or even the books, because the whole notion of the Witcher TV show was, hey, this is supposed to be an adaptation of the books, but it seems like they're straying away from the books. They don't like the game's lore or the book's lore, and they want to kind of do their own thing. That's kind of that interesting territory where it's kind of like, yeah, like when you were closer to the books, like you probably had a lot more people's attention, but now that you're kind of going off doing your own thing, you might end up losing people along the way. So you have to find that perfect and balancing act of being true to what you're adapting, keep to its heart and its nature is kind of first and foremost. Like, let these characters and this story kind of be true to what it was, but also you can put your own spin on it, because with The Last of Us, as we've seen, you can take something and you can elaborate on something that might have been a smaller thing, and you can make it a bigger, more prevalent thing in the story. Because yes, Bill has his role to play in the story, but Bill and Frank's story in The Last of Us TV show is quite different than the game in some regards, because in other regards you could be like, yes, they changed things quite differently, but you could also say it added on to what was kind of already there to some extent. So you got to dive into something that you really didn't get a chance to dive into in the game because it didn't exist for you to dive into in the game. So it's just it's that interesting, like I said, tightrope of like adapting something, like, because you don't want to be too exact carbon copy, because if you are, it's just like, well, then what's the point of adapting it? But the moment you change it and you add to it, you flush things out a little bit more, that's where you kind of get to that really interesting part. And that's what makes The Last of Us so fascinating. Because I mean, I don't know what the fan base is like. I don't know whether it feels like the way people talk about it is like, yes, there's a good chunk of people who've played the game who are watching it, but maybe at this point a lot of them have trailed off just because maybe it just didn't reach their expectations. But it feels like mainly people who probably don't know the story, and that's always been my interest in that too, of like, oh, like people who've played the game, what are their thoughts about it, but also people who don't know the story of the game, what are their thoughts about it? So it's like I said, that's such an interesting and fascinating thing as well. I mean, using that Trails of Cold Steel Northern War anime, I don't know if you could enjoy that anime without the I mean, I think you could, but like that's such a slice of life thing in the regards of without the greater context of that story. You still could be, but obviously it's like, I feel like I don't know if you could enjoy that anime 100% without like having a greater context of this, because it's literally Trails of Cold Steel 2.5. It is literally smack dab in the middle of the Erebonia arc. So that's what makes it so interesting. It's like you've got 2 games before it, and there are 2 games after this event. It's smack dab in the middle of a story that if you don't have the full context of, I don't know if you could fully enjoy it, but maybe you could. I'd actually be really interested to hear that from someone who's into anime and stuff. Like, it might, maybe, because that could also be my extreme bias of why I enjoy it so much, is because I'm obsessed with the Trails of Cold Steel series, and anything added to that, I'm excited for, you know, especially this past episode, certain characters maybe, some characters interacted last episode, so that was pretty dope. Because I know that it's come up once again with other, like, you know, not even just the movies, because I know there have been TV shows that are adaptations of comic books where there's like a Lock and Key or the Umbrella Academy, or a great example would be The Boys. I've heard from, not saying this is always applicable, but I know a lot from some people, they've actually said that they like the TV show more than they do the comic book, just with a lot of the commentary that the TV show has, which obviously the comic book had a lot of those commentaries too, but like the fun that they're able to have with the show while also being poignant and, you know, telling this very compelling story, that's in a very interesting spot in that regard. But other adaptations, you know, it's that whole, oh, the book was better. You know, you hear that a lot about movies and things that were based on books and stuff like that. I know, like, The Magicians, for one instance, is kind of in an interesting spot, because that series is based on a trilogy of books, which, spoilers, but not really. The books, roughly speaking, where the show was, like, the show went about season 2-ish, like, near the end of season 2, is kind of where the books end, and so everything else is, I think, kind of its own thing. Like season 3, 4, and 5 are kind of its own thing in that regard, and obviously, so it's quite different, obviously, with the TV show than like the books, for example. So I think that's such an interesting comparison. I'm sure there's stuff that was on the cutting room floor, stuff they didn't adapt in that wise, and I know there are things that they straight up change, characters change, stories change in those regards, once again, because it also goes further than where the books did. It's a very endless conversation that, once again, you could end up having, because I think, for one, it just comes down to your particular preferences, and I think, you know, once again, like how someone goes about adapting something. And I'd love to get to know your thoughts about that, kind of using some of the examples, and I mean, using The Last of Us as a prime example, because I feel like that's the most recent example, and it's such a big example of, you know, I'm curious, first and foremost, how do you, if you are watching The Last of Us, do let me know, are you someone that's familiar with the story? Are you familiar, do you know some of the story and not all of it, or do you know all of it and are currently watching The Last of Us, or are you someone who doesn't know the story and you're kind of going into this blind? So with that, I'm so curious from both perspectives. Are you enjoying the show? But more specifically from those who know the story, like, do you feel like it's a good adaptation? Kind of let me know your reasons why. Obviously, avoid spoilers for anyone that's not fully caught up. Obviously, don't spoil any future events just in case someone, once again, doesn't know the story. And how does that compare to other adaptations in that regard? Whether it's movies or TV shows being adapted from a book, other video games or animes or manga? Would you want more adaptations to kind of take note from The Last of Us? Or would you have notes to be like, yeah, you wish that it still was even more different than it already is? Just let me know all your thoughts in the comments down below. Really, that's all I'm going to talk about. Till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day and goodbye.